Welcome back to this Boomi bundle demo. In this part, we will be diving into the sales order sync, so the process that ships with the bundle for retrieving sales orders from Shopify and syncing them to NetSuite. In part one of this series, I went through the inventory item sync and along with the inventory levels. So I will provide a link in the description below to that part of the demo. So without further ado, let's jump into this Shopify orders to NetSuite process. Just a word up front, I have pre-configured the connector components that's required to hook up to each account. So one for NetSuite, one for Shopify. In the other video, I also go through this process step by step if you're not entirely sure how this could be done. So the connections are set up and working. So just a word from a high level about this process. We're really performing three main tasks, if you will. So the first sub-process will fetch sales orders from the Shopify account. We're filtering on a Shopify field called updated at minimum date. We'll see that in a second. So we're retrieving the Shopify orders. We then handle the customer first inside NetSuite. So we check whether this Shopify customer already exists in our ERP. And we either update if it does and create a new one if it's a new customer. So handling the customer is the first part of the branch shape that we have here. We then proceed to extract the customer details that we have just manipulated and do the same thing for the sales order. So we check if this is an existing sales order in the NetSuite account, and we either create a new one or update based on that check. So the first shape of interest is this Shopify query by date sub-process. We have an entry point, a try catch. We're setting some dynamic process property using this set properties shape. This is purely for logging purposes. And as with all other outbound requests, we have this shop connector shape, which is used to send the request to Shopify, so the action is a query. As with all connector shapes, you need to specify a connection object. This is the Shopify connection we pre-configured, and an operation. The operation is really the request structure, if you will, where you specify exactly what record type you would like to retrieve. So just to show you how you could filter, so if you access the operation and go to the filters tab, you can see that there's this filter that comes pre-configured with the bundle. You have a reference text and the actual field from the Shopify schema which we're using, which is the updated at minimum field. This will essentially retrieve all Shopify orders that have a last modified date greater than the date that we pass as a parameter here. And the way you do that is by accessing this parameters tab. You could see there's one already set up, and you could say, give us all orders that were modified past this date. So 6th of June. I've set up a couple of orders in my Shopify account, and you could see that this was created on the 6th. So this should be picked up. This was created on the 3rd, but modified today. So this should also be included in the results. So let's test this and see what kind of documents we're retrieving from this sub-process. That's done. So clicking on the return documents shape, you could see that we have two results here. And indeed, this is one of the Shopify orders. And this is the second one. So our orders are being picked up fine. And the XML structure you saw in that final step is due to the fact that we have this map shape where we map the Shopify response to what in Boomi bundle lingo is called a canonical profile. So this is a intermediary XML profile that we map to between Shopify and the eventual Netsuite sales order create XML profile that's required by the Netsuite WSDL. So, but long story short, we just extract the fields of interest from the Shopify sales order response and map it to this Boomi order profile. And that's all mapped with the bundle. So we return the sales orders that we fetch back to the main process. We then encounter this branch shape. So the branch shape gives you the ability to execute multiple actions sequentially. So branch 1 would be executed first, and then it would proceed to the remaining branches. So the first thing that we do in branch 1 is, again, we handle the customer details first. So we have this map shape, which we see is mapping now from the order profile, which we've just retrieved from the Shopify response, to a dedicated customer XML profile. So this would be a good opportunity actually to just demonstrate how the mapping works. Really, it's just a drag and drop mechanism. So you could drag one property from one profile to the other. So for example, we can map first name and last name. We have this full name property here on the right, and Boomi gives you the ability to manipulate values along the way. And so one of those is that you could concatenate two strings using a delimiter of your choosing. So we'll just use a space, and this will be the join of the first name and the last name. We'll configure this by mapping the inputs, and then the result would be the concatenated string, which we assign to this full name property. So that's one way that you can transform values also between source and destination profiles. Boomi doesn't only give you the ability to work with primitives, so you could modify strings. You have some numeric calculations that you can perform on two numbers. You have date formatting, several kinds of lookups. So for example, you could fetch documents that you have stored to any cache, which we will see in a second. You can make external calls along the way. So for example, you could fetch a customer field from some other system by passing the ID and making an external HTTP request. So you also have the ability to inject full-on script. So it's a really powerful section. So for now, this is the customer profile that we will use to create the customer in NetSuite. One thing to keep in mind is that there would be some mandatory fields depending on what preferences you have in your preferred transaction forms, of course. But in general, whenever you are creating resources via the SOAP API, then it's good practice to just preview the fields that are required when you're actually creating the resource via the UI, because more often than not, then these would be the same fields that you would need to populate or actually include in the request. So here in this account, I see on this customer form, we have the category, which is mandatory, the company name, and the subsidiary. So we just need to make sure that we populate these fields in our profiles. And just to speed things up, there's this customer type property which we can use to map to the category eventually. Subsidiary ID would usually be determined dynamically, so either based on the Shopify store that you are pulling from or some other identifier which comes with the order that you can then map and fetch the right subsidiary. In our case, I know that the items in the test orders, which we will use for this demo, are under one specific subsidiary in general, so we can just go ahead and hard code the subsidiary ID. And lastly, and quite importantly actually, so this Boomi bundle uses some custom fields to store Shopify IDs on the transactions which you will create, something called Boomi external ID or something like that. So I will not be using any custom fields. We can actually use the native NetSuite external ID for storing the Shopify as a foreign key, the Shopify ID for both customers and sales orders as a foreign reference. So if we take the customer IDs ID field, which is where the Shopify customer ID has been mapped to, then we will say this would be the external ID for the customer that we create inside NetSuite. So with that, we've prepared the customer profile, which we'll then access in this next sub-process. So moving on, you see there's this NetSuite customer upsert sub-process. Again, we have an entry point and a try catch, another branch. So we start from branch 1. And the first thing we encounter is this connector shape. Again, connector shape is simply an external request. This time we ping NetSuite. We have the connection pre-configured, and the operation also comes with the bundle. And it's a customer query by email. So this means that we're going to extract the email that was passed along from Shopify for this customer, query NetSuite to see if the customer exists, and if so, store the results or possibly even fetch the ID of this customer, the external ID, for example, which we know would be the Shopify ID, and save it to the cache, because we will then use the cache to determine whether this customer exists or not in this decision shape, and either update the existing customer or create a new one. So again, every connector shape needs an operation. In this case, we are searching a customer by email. I'm just going to uncheck all these fields just to avoid including any custom fields which do not exist in my account. And we will say, for example, just include external and internal ID. You'll see why in a second. And importantly, we have a filter, which is the NetSuite customer email that we search on. So that's already set. We need to pass the actual email of the Shopify customer. So again, this is done in the parameter section. And this time we don't have a static value. We have a value which is coming from an XML profile, which is the customer profile that we prepared in the step before. The email address is in this rather awkward internet address, work email address property. So this is how we pass the email to the NetSuite query. So that will execute, and then we encounter this add to cache shape. So this permits you to save some documents to a store, which you could then access and reuse in subsequent steps. So for every cache, you need to define a document cache profile. So this is essentially telling Boomi what profiles we would be storing to the cache. And most importantly, you need to define an index by which you would access and search the list of documents that you have in this cache. So the bundle is using this Boomi external ID. We can edit this and say we will just use the NetSuite native customer external ID, which we know comes from Shopify, so which is essentially the Shopify ID. So we can save that. So we'll check whether the customer exists and dump the results into the cache. So then in branch 2, we encounter this decision shape. Decision shape gives you the ability to compare two values, so first value, second value, and based on the result of this comparison, then you can branch off accordingly. The values could be static, as in the case of the second value, which is just undefined, or it could be the result of some operation. And for the first value, we are performing a document cache lookup, which is searching the existing NetSuite customer cache that we've just set up. The index is the only ID index that we have configured. The output would be, let's say, the external ID that we find. So we're pulling that just to signify that a match was found. And the key is going to be the external ID that we have mapped in the previous step. This is the Shopify ID. So you can save that. And if the customer exists in NetSuite, then we will update that customer. When updating resources, you need to provide either the internal ID of the record or the external ID. And since we're executing this branch, if we had a match, then we know we can fetch the ID from the cache. So we can say, let's look up the document cache. Let us output the internal ID of the customer. Because when we create the sales order, we actually need to pass the internal ID to the entity ID for the sales order creation. So we can return this the customer internal ID, and we will say again, search the cache by the Shopify customer ID, and if there's a match, then return the internal ID. Actually, over here, since this is the update profile for the NetSuite customer, then we can actually even use the external ID. You could use both, but let's use the external ID. I just need to pause the video and take this call, and I'll be right back in a second. We're back, and yeah, so I was saying that you could use either the internal ID or external ID to update the customer. So we've chosen to extract the external ID, which we know is safe to the customer, and we will use that in the update operation. So let's save and close that. The customer create mapping requires a few more updates. So we said that we'd like to store the Shopify ID in the external ID field of the customer. So we can map that to the external ID. Previously, we said we would map the first and last name of the customer, and in total disregard of all PII policies, then we'll just map the full name, which we concatenated, to the company name, which was a mandatory field. So that's another mapping we need to do. Subsidiary ID is pre-mapped, so that's fine. And we had the customer type, which we said we would map to the category. So that should be sufficient for creating a new customer. So let's save that. So our update and create branches then rejoin at this decision shape called isSuccess. So this takes value from the response profile that's returned by the connector shape. There's a parameter called success. Netsuite actually fills this with a value of true if your request was processed successfully. So we're just handling each case separately. There's one thing that we need to do in this successful response path. So we have this map here. You could see that the Netsuite response would only contain the internal ID of the customer resource that was successfully processed. And we need to carry along both the internal ID and also the external ID, which we will use further down the line. So the internal ID could be mapped to any field in this canonical profile. Let's use the associated object ID to store the Netsuite internal ID. And to retrieve the Shopify customer ID, let's say, or to retrieve any customer value, you could make an external call to query the Netsuite customer by its internal ID and fetch any columns that you'd like to include. So what we could do is go to the customer query by email operation. In fact, we need to do the exact opposite. So we want to query the customer by ID this time. So we could say this would be customer query by ID. And we just need to fetch the external ID. I mean, you could fetch any field that's necessary. So for example, the email that's coming from the Netsuite customer record, and the filter over here this time needs to be internal ID. Because we are searching by the ID that was returned in the response. So we could save this operation. Back to the connector call function, we say this is a Netsuite query. The operation is the ID customer operation we've just set up. We're passing the internal ID as the input, and we'd like to include, can you multi-select? No, we'd like to include the external ID and the email for argument's sake, which we won't use for anything, but you could include as many fields as you like. So the request would take the internal ID as the input, and will map the customer external ID in this external ID field. So we'll save that. So this customer upsert subprocess would return successfully processed customers inside NetSuite, and we'd have access to the internal ID and the external ID for those customers. So let's save and close. And the final shape in this step is just dumping the results of this upsert operation to a cache. You could see that the external ID is being used as the index, so this is why we actually mapped this in the response mapping. And so that should work out of the box. Moving on to branch 2. So this is where we prepare the sales order profile and either create or update the sales order. So this add customer info map has actually a scripting function set up where you can inject some code. We can just say, let us look up the successfully processed customer cache and fetch the internal ID of this customer, so we can map it to the entity ID for the sales order create. So that's customer external ID. The output would be the internal ID of the customer. And since this is the original canonical profile, then the Shopify customer ID is this field right here. So customer ID's ID, we search the cache by the Shopify ID, and we store the internal ID in the customer ID's internal ID field. So this is we've prepared, let's say, the customer internal ID for the sales order upsert. So we jump into this final sub-process. Looks pretty similar to the customer upsert. We have an entry point, a try catch, a branch shape, and another connector code. So this is doing the same task that we did for the customer. We're making a request to NetSuite by the Shopify sales order ID, which will be the external ID in NetSuite, and we're determining whether it exists or not, saving to the cache, and moving on. So if we inspect the operation, again, I'm just gonna include the external ID, which is what we would like to return. And here, the filter is order Shopify ID, which is the external ID in NetSuite. So we make the call to NetSuite and we map the result. So you see this sales order query response. We're not interested in the internal ID. We are interested in the external ID of the sales order, and we'll map it to this external ID field on the Boomi order profile. So this is the Shopify sales order ID in the external ID property from the Boomi order profile. So that should be enough. and we store the result to the cache, again by the external ID as the index. So as with the customer, we use a cache lookup to fetch whether there was a match. So the cache index is the order ID. The output parameter is, let's say, the external ID. And we search the cache by the by the Shopify ID, the Shopify sales order ID. So that's fine. And we're saying compare the result to static value of undefined. If it is undefined, then that means the order does not exist in the account. So we can move on to this create branch. So let's see what's being mapped over here. So to create a sales order, again, we need a sales order create request. This is the profile that we're using for the 2017.2 WSDL. And we will store the Shopify sales order ID in the external Netsuite ID. We need to specify the customer's internal ID and map that to the entity ID in the create request, and we stored this actually to this alternate associated object ID field. So we map that to the customer internal ID. And here there are a couple of things which we need to do. So our Shopify items are corresponding uniquely to NetSuite items by the same SKU. And in the sales order create request, we need to provide the NetSuite internal ID of the item. So what we can do here is, again, map the result of an external call to NetSuite by the SKU name and map the internal ID of the item to the internal ID placeholder for the item in the creation profile. To do that, we need a completely new operation. So again, with every connector shape call, you need to specify an operation. So let's create a new one. We'll say this is an inventory item query by name. We'll use NetSuite. This is where you make a request to NetSuite to fetch the item type, the record type for your operation. I filtered by the words inventory item. So we'd like to create an operation for this type. That's fine. This takes a while. I might actually cut the video and resume when this request returns. All right, we're back. So we would like to set up our own filters in the operation. So again, what we're interested in is the internal ID. We'll add a filter and say this is the item name is, the name field is item ID in the schema. I will say this is. So that is the operation set up. Now we just need to make the external call. So run a query, inventory item by name. We'll fetch the internal ID. And we say the SKU from Shopify is our parameter. And we'll map the internal ID to the item internal ID in the create profile. So that's the item set. The sales order line in NetSuite needs an amount, and this is not being calculated automatically in my account. What we can do is we can say, let's calculate the amount by multiplying two values. We'll multiply the unit price by the quantity and map this to the amount field. So the create sales order mapping should be done. We're storing the Shopify order ID to the external ID field. We've specified the customer's internal ID and configured some of the items columns, line item columns. So that could be saved. If the order was an existing one, then we'll just leave this mapping as it is. And as with the customer, we can look up the cache, our sales order cache, and fetch either the internal ID or the external ID. I believe we used the external ID in storing the cache. So let's fetch that. And we will say search our cache by Shopify ID and fetch the external ID so that we could use it as the, let's say, the primary key for this update operation. With that, we should be able to just run a test and see how this is working. So I'd just like to verify that these customers don't exist in my test account. That's fine. This VEREF does not exist. By the way, these are orders for tennis rackets by celebrity tennis players that we are dealing with here. So important stuff. And Roger Federer is also a new customer. So let's go ahead and test this out. So you could see which shape is executing by this loading icon. And the path that was followed, each shape is highlighted to indicate that it was complete. So this is complete. What I really like about Boomi is the logging, the level of detail that's provided with the logs. So for each process, you could dive into every shape and see what's happening at every step of the way, which is really cool for debugging. So for example, if we click on the shape after the first Shopify fetch, then you would have the results that was returned by the return document shape of that process. So this is our two Shopify orders which we mapped. If you do the same for, or let's dive into the sub process for the customer upset and see what happened. So you could see that we've made the call, and then the decision shape evaluated to false. The customer does not exist in NetSuite. So then we mapped, and here we rejoined to the result of each connector call. So clicking on this is success shape, you could see there are two documents. This is actually the response from the connector call. So you see NetSuite responded with the following fields. And so let's take the internal ID of this customer and just make sure it exists in our account. So Mr. Zverev has successfully been created. I did see the external ID in the response, but if you wanted to see that, you have it here. So that seems like it was fine. I just realized actually that the external ID is indeed returned in the response, and so the additional lookup that we performed in this response map was superfluous. We did demonstrate how you could actually embellish the response by searching for the email, for example, for the customer. So that was not time wasted. And clicking on the return documents shape, then you can see that this is how we've actually mapped the response to be returned to the parent process. So customer was created fine. Let's have a look at the sales order. So is this a new order evaluated to true? So we've attempted to create a new order. We have two results in the decision shape. And again, this is a successful response from NetSuite. We do have an external ID. This is, as we agreed, the Shopify order ID. So if we take an order and search for that, happens to be the same one. So that link has been made. So that's all well and good. And let's just ensure that the sales order looks fine inside NetSuite. So we'll take the internal ID of the order. We see our two orders over there. So this order from Zverev for one head gravity racket of 190 euros was posted to NetSuite with the right customer, the right item. The amount is what we calculated, so that seems fine. And also the external ID, which is the Shopify ID, would be in the external ID inside NetSuite. So that seems like it worked just fine. And that's pretty much it. So we could choose to just run this flow again to check whether the logic we've set up to determine whether records already exist inside the account actually work. In fact, what we could possibly do is, so this was modified on the 6th of June last, this order. This one was modified today. So we could modify the date and narrow it down to update just one. So let's say this is the 8th. We'll save that and re-trigger the sync and see what happens. We expect that we have now one Shopify order being retrieved, and that our logic would simply update the existing records that have been created in the previous sync. So this has completed. Let's see if that was the case. We do have one result, so the date filter seems to be working fine. Does the customer exist in NetSuite evaluated to true? So that's good. You could always inspect the logs on the decision shape, and Boomi actually logs the first value and the second value to see how things are working. So this is great for debugging. And in fact, if you recall, the first value was the result of a document cache lookup, which is truthy actually. So that means that the customer did exist. So it followed the update path. And for the sales order, is this a new order evaluated to false? So it followed the update path and proceeded with that. So if you've stuck around until this point, my congratulations. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.